and welcome to the Practical Prophetic, where prophetic ministry is made practical. I'm Beth Wingate, I'm your host, and welcome to the podcast. On our podcast today, we are continuing our deep dive, old school, systematic Bible study on the story, the paradigm, the pattern of Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah. And so my prayer is that this will be practical to you in a prophetic way. Maybe you are Naboth in the paradigm. Maybe you are Jehu. Maybe you are Elijah. Where do you fit in to this story? Maybe you're just a witness. And so I feel like in my spiritual walk, I have largely been a witness to these things, but I've had a couple of incidents where I was actually the Naboth in the story, and I hope to one day be the Elijah in the story. That'd be awesome, or at least the Elisha. But anyway, or the Jehu, that might be incredible. But today I want to look at 1 Kings chapter 21. We're making our way through this story because there's so much application here, so much prophetic application. And we know that Paul tells us that the stories in the Old Testament are examples to us. And so we can look at these stories as a template and have a good idea of how we're supposed to respond in these situations. Now, let's go back and cover a couple of things. We know that you cannot have a kingdom without a king. So Ahab is the king. He is the king of northern Israel with the capital in Samaria, and he has brought in paganism, worship of Baal and Ashtoreth. Primarily, though, Ahab is focused on worship of Baal. He disobeys God, of course, by doing that, and he makes it the national religion. So this is now mingled with Judaism. And then he also rebels against God by marrying a foreign queen, and she is Jezebel, who is a usurper of authority, and she's primarily focused on the worship of Ashtoreth. And she is a brutal queen who has tried to hunt down and kill all the prophets. There's only 7,000 quote-unquote good guys left in the land, and that's thanks to some heroic acts of people who hid the prophets. Elijah has the showdown in Mount Carmel. Then Elijah flees into the wilderness when Jezebel puts the hit out on his life. And he has this incredible encounter with God at Mount Horeb. And now we're back at the palace. A couple of years have probably passed at this point. This whole scene takes a span of about 21 years. And so we're going to see that Ahab, who's flip-flopped all the time, he's very passive, very weak. He's always kind of taking the temperature and trying to please everyone. And this is what allowed Jezebel to be in her position. Also, the other thing I wanted to bring out was that you cannot have a Jezebel without an Ahab. Ahab could have shut her down at any time. He is the king. And we see this pattern replicated in politics. Jonathan Cahn has written extensively about that. We've seen this pattern in churches and families and businesses. An example of this would be here in the great state of Alabama. Our governor, Dr. Robert Bentley, he had an affair with a political advisor, and they said that she had set up a desk out in front of his office and was the gatekeeper on who had access to the governor and was making decisions as if she was the acting governor, which he allowed to happen. Of course, it all came out and was exposed, and it was a big scandal, and he was forced to resign in 2017, so not even that long ago. I remember that story just being crazy when it happened, but it was another picture, another example of how this spirit can work in a system, in a political system. We've seen that in lots of other systems too. I know that I remember a pastor one time, he was teaching on the Jezebel spirit, and he said that he was part of a presbyter board over a denomination, and there was an issue going on with the church, and he said they came in to have a meeting, and the pastor was there, and he said there was a few other people there as well, and he said there was this woman there, and that she was in the room, and he wasn't exactly sure who she was. From his understanding, she did not have an official position there, and he said she had a giant key ring, and obviously it had keys to all the doors in the church. And he felt like the Lord highlighted that to his attention. And when they began to question the pastor about some issues they were having, this lady kept chiming in. And finally, he said that he turned to this woman. He said, "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but you're not relevant to this conversation." And that she got all upset. And then the pastor began to defend her. And, he said it was just a mess. And he said it became apparent to him that this pastor had allowed this person to run things and wreak havoc in that church, and all the fallout then of course happened. He was just using that as an example, but that's how this spirit works. And so you cannot have a Jezebel without an Ahab, that weak leadership, or maybe it's naive leadership or blind leadership, but typically it is someone who actually hands the power over. Okay, we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 21, and we're going to dig back into this story. So during this time, the last thing we left off with, Elijah has his encounter like Moses on Mount Horeb with the Lord. And now it says in 1 Kings 21, starting in verse 1, it says, "And now it came to pass after these things," meaning after all the things we've done in the last 5 or 6 podcasts, "that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel." It says, "hard by the palace of King Ahab of Samaria," meaning it was right next to the property, the royal property of the palace. All right, it says, "And Ahab spoke unto Naboth, saying, Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near to my house, and I will give thee a better vineyard than this. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you a lot of money for your vineyard." Now, let me just stop right here before we even plow on with what Naboth's response is. First of all, the king already owns everything in the land. He already gets the lion's share. He levies a tribute or a tax or tariff on everything in the land, and he already gets the best 10% of Naboth's vineyard, the first fruits. Why does he need Naboth's vineyard? He already has massive holdings of his own. Why is he looking for the one thing he can't have? This reminds me, this is familiar to me, of the story, if we go back to the garden of Adam and Eve. God told them, you can have all the trees, and all the trees in the garden are good, except for one tree. You cannot have that tree. And what's the very thing they ended up going after, Eve did, and later Adam, was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God told them was forbidden. And so this is what happens, though, sometimes. People who are in positions of power become very clouded because they become surrounded by people who tell them how great they are, who tell them how wonderful they are, how spiritual, how smart, whatever. And they just cannot handle the accolades and the glitter. There was an old minister one time that we encountered, and he said it was an issue we had in a church, and they came to bring this guy in, and he shook his head and he said, it's usually one of the 3 G's that'll get you. The downfall of someone. He said it's the glitter, the gold, or the girls, and you could substitute in there guys. So the glitter represents the attention, the infamy, the notoriety that people get when they're in a position of leadership. Some people cannot handle the fame of being a leader. They can't handle the prestige. They can't handle all that glitter brings from other people. Of course, the gold represents the money. Some people just want to accumulate everything. And then some people, their downfall is lust. It's the guys or the girls. And so in this case, I think it's the glitter and the gold right here, because Ahab got very spoiled. He became very accustomed to everyone being yes men all around him. I've watched that in churches before. I've been in a big mega church, and we watched people basically fall all over themselves to be in proximity to the pastor, and they would dote on the pastor, give him elaborate gifts, and all kind of things, and it became almost crazy to watch how people would behave to position themselves close to the pastor. And so, that never goes right, never turns out good in the end, just a cautionary tale there. But I've watched that in churches before. I've seen it in the business world. I've seen people that have, powerful businesses. They'll have what I call like lackeys, or they'll have like a fraternity. They'll have all these young guys, just all falling all over themselves to be in his proximity, in his orbit. And so that can be dangerous. But these are little things that can happen. The king became very spoiled, and he thought that he was entitled to everything. Well, let's talk about what happens next, and let's talk about why this is important. If we pick it up, in verse 3, it says, "And Naboth said to Ahab, 'Oh, no, the Lord forbid me that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee.'" He's like, "Oh, whoa, wait a minute. That's my inheritance." Well, let's talk about that. Now, what does Naboth mean by this inheritance? Well, let's read a couple of scriptures to give you the idea of what this means about why Naboth could not sell or trade his land with the king. One of those would be the Ten Commandments. In Deuteronomy 5:21, it says, "Neither shall you covet your neighbor's wife, neither shall you covet your neighbor's house or field, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Coveting something is that's not good. That's a sin. That's what we just read here. In Micah 2, verses 1 through 2, it says, "Alas, for those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds, when the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in their power. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress the householder and the house, people and their inheritance." Let me give us one more. Isaiah 5:8 says, "Ah, you who join house to house and who add field to field until there is room for none but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land." Okay, so I think I've established that it's okay to have your own land, but you can't be going after everybody else's stuff and especially mistreating them. And this was his inheritance. And he's like, no, the Lord forbid it. I can't do that. Let's talk about what happens when you get an inheritance. I'm thinking of the story of Jacob and Esau. Esau was very impetuous and impulsive, and he ended up, because he was hungry, trading his inheritance for a bowl of soup, for a bowl of porridge, and just crazy. I'm thinking, honestly, I'm thinking of Prince Harry, who just said, he didn't want to be a working royal anymore. He didn't want to have to shake people's hands and cut ribbons and all of those kind of things, because he was being photographed, or there was some people felt some kind of way about his wife or whatever, but that was his inheritance. It came with a lot of perks too, and he just traded it. He just said, "I'm going to go live off of other people in America." And so that's the decision he made. And it sounds like he might be having some second thoughts, because one of those perks was that he had security, and now he doesn't have that. And so he probably didn't think that through very well. In my opinion, he traded his inheritance for a bowl of porridge. He made a bad decision. And the reasons for that can be debated. But whatever the case, it was his inheritance, and he's the one that walked away. And so we have a modern example of that. So the king was tempting Naboth to trade his inheritance. This makes me think of things I've witnessed all my years in church. I've actually watched this happen before. There was a church we were in one time where they had built this church from the ground up. It was going great. Things were going wonderful. And they hit a hiccup. And the pastor that was there, he had been an evangelist, and he decided as soon as there was the first sign of trouble, he basically said he was going to be resigning and stepping down and going to go back into being an evangelist. Now, in my opinion, he traded that inheritance. That church was his field. That was his vineyard. He built it. And he just kind of walked away from it at the first sign of trouble. And that was so discouraging and disappointing to see. And And so sometimes these things happen. You've watched, I'm sure, people, especially in a family or in business, where people have just made the decision that they didn't want to do that. They stepped away from it. I know a guy who his family had a well-established, profitable business, and it would have been the third generation to take that family business, and he didn't want to do that. He wanted to do something else, and in my opinion, I don't think that was the wise decision. I think he walked away from a generational inheritance. And with the generational inheritance comes generational blessings. And so this is one of those things that we have to consider. Now let's talk about this real quick. I just want to lay down some principles and some ideas. I'm taking this from the Heritage Foundation, but they have an article that gives a historical perspective on estate taxes. Now from 1970 until about 1976, we saw in America many family farms that were lost because of the estate tax, but they call it the death tax, but it was an inheritance tax on farms. One of the things our country and the whole West is built on is land ownership. We came from an agrarian society, so land ownership is important. In fact, that's part of what the Revolutionary War was fought over, was Boston Tea Party, the tax on tea, taxation without representation. And after the Revolutionary War, basically to finance that war, they imposed a Stamp Act, which basically meant all of these various taxes anytime that you had to do any kind of legal documents. It's called the Stamp Act, but it was actually about paperwork. And part of that was an inheritance or land tax that bankrupted a lot of people, and they would have to sell off plots of their land to satisfy this tax, and that tax was levied to finance the Revolutionary War. In fact, we're going to see that in every war, they pretty much levy these kind of taxes all over the world. Even here in America, during the Civil War, they levied a land tax, and it was called the Tax Act of 1862. In fact, they added an inheritance tax in 1864, and it was finally repealed in the early 1870s. But this was not new. In World War I, they did the same thing. And so we see that this is one of the ways that government makes money. Well, I'm going to tell you, that is wrong. Government should not be doing that. That is not the way that government is supposed to be doing business. It's a prophetic pattern tied to Ahab to pressure people to give up their inheritance, something God gave them. And one of the markers of this Jezebel spirit is you will see that people will walk away or sell out on their spiritual inheritance. I've watched people who have had ministries or have had a calling. Maybe it's in music ministry. Maybe they're the guitar player in a worship band, and that was their spiritual inheritance. God gave them that gift, and they were using it for the glory of God. And then all of a sudden they just walk away from it because someone pressured them to do that or whatever. And really, you're cheating yourself out of blessings when you do that. And really, it's connected to this same prophetic paradigm of the story of Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah. Okay, I think I've established about inheritance and why we don't just walk away or trade or sell out on our inheritance. But this is what Ahab pressures Naboth to do. And anytime someone tries to pressure you out of something that God has given you, like a ministry, like your family land, your home maybe that God gave you, and people are pressuring you, you need to be in serious prayer. You need to seek counsel because it could be a spiritual attack. See if the paradigm applies. Pray about it. In verse 21, after Naboth has told the king Ahab, "No, I can't do that, God forbid," Ahab came into the house heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. Poor King Ahab. He said, "I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers." So he laid down on his bed, turned his face away, and would not eat bread. In other words, he went home, took to the bed, and pouted. He was depressed about this. Verse 5, but Jezebel, dun dun dun, here's the villain. Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said unto him, why is your spirit so sad that you can't even eat bread? And he said unto her, because I spoke with Naboth the Jezreelite, and said unto him, give me your vineyard for money, or else, if it please thee, I will give thee another vineyard for it. And he answered that he would not give me that vineyard. In fact, he says, I will not give you my vineyard. All right, Jezebel, verse 7, his wife said, dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? In other words, she said, who is the king of Israel? Arise, eat bread, and let your heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. Oh my goodness. So that's where I'm going to leave off today. We're going to pick up the story next week with the schemes and the webs of Jezebel and dig deeper into this story. But Naboth is going to be the victim here. He becomes the target, all because of envy. Because Ahab wanted something that was not his. And I'm going to say something a little dangerous here. You know, the difference between jealousy and envy, and make no mistake about it, it was a beautiful vineyard right there on the border of the palace lands. And Ahab saw it because Naboth had been tending that garden. He had made that vineyard beautiful. And so Ahab decided, I want that. That would be the perfect garden for me. You know, it was lush and beautiful and productive and fruitful. And, you know, that's the practical take-home prophetic lesson today. Sometimes when you're like Naboth and you're tending your business, you're taking care of your part for the kingdom of God. You're being fruitful. You're winning converts. You're gaining, you know, you're mentoring and discipling people. Maybe you're leading a small group. You're faithful. You're earnest in what you're doing. You're a tither. You know, you're serving in your church and you're doing all the things you're supposed to do, and you become fruitful. There will be people with an Ahab spirit that want what you have. They become jealous. Ahab in this picture represents jealousy, and they want what you have. But Jezebel, we're going to learn next week, represents envy. Now, the difference between jealousy and envy is jealousy wants what you have, but envy not only wants what you have, but will manipulate, scheme, and demand that they have that and will destroy you in the process. So that's where we're going next week. This is a tale as old as time, and this is a pattern that repeats all of the time, and this is part of a template, a prophetic template. And so I want to encourage you this week to think about, what is your spiritual inheritance? What is something that God has given you from your Heavenly Father as a gift? A garden that you are to tend and guard, just like Adam was told to tend and guard the garden. You need to protect your ministry. You need to protect those talents and gifts that God has given you. You need to be a good steward of what God has given you. Don't let someone who is jealous come in and talk you out of what God gave you. Don't sell out. Don't walk away. Don't trade it for something else. Guard and tend your spiritual garden, because that is your inheritance. I hope today's message blesses and encourages you. Have a blessed day. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll be informed next time I post. Thank you again, and have a blessed day.